It was really surprising to me how much it was framed as a uniquely young men shaped problem for the Republican Party, when I really don't think that's the case.
Yes, Donald Trump is losing ground among different groups, including young men, but not necessarily so much faster among one group than another that we should necessarily just put all the focus, the narrative focus, on that one group.
Which you would expect, right? If the electorate is moving, people are generally going to be moving in the same direction, even if the order of magnitude is a little bit different.
Welcome to the Decision Desk HQ podcast. I'm Geoffrey Skelley, your host, the chief elections analyst here at Decision Desk HQ. Since the 2024 election, one growing narrative in our political coverage is the extent to which President Donald Trump has lost ground with young men. This is no idle concern for Trump. In 2024, he did better with young voters than he had in his past elections. He still lost among 18 to 29-year-olds on the whole, with Kamala Harris winning around 55% of the vote in that age cohort, sort of depending on which survey or study you looked at. But overall, Trump improved among young men in particular, either narrowly winning or narrowly losing them, again, depending on which survey you were looking at. The explanations for this have ranged from general negative economic sentiments about the Biden administration to Trump and the GOP's better embrace of podcasters and influencers in getting their message out during the 2024 campaign. Recent polling, however, suggests that young men may have soured on Trump. One recent study making the rounds from the left-leaning Speaking with American Men project found that Trump's favorability rating had fallen from 56% in the spring of 2025 to 46% in the fall of 2025, and perhaps has fallen since then. This and other reporting on frustrations with the cost of living and other economic factors have regularly focused on men. But how much is it just men and young men? Joining me today, I have Mary Radcliffe, head of research at 50+1 and a former colleague of mine at 538. Mary recently dug into Trump's approval data on her Substack to explore to what extent Trump and the GOP have lost ground among men and young men, and how much more they have lost among those groups than other groups overall. And her answer, well, spoiler alert, there's not necessarily a big difference between the decline among young men and what we've seen among other groups. So with that, let's talk about Trump's approval, age, gender, the electorate, what some of this could mean for the 2026 midterms. So Mary, welcome back to the Decision Desk HQ podcast.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Glad to be here.
Yeah, well, obviously, great to have you. For those who may not have heard Mary on her previous appearance on the podcast, she is basically like the poll gathering maven. She was the lead person for gathering all the polls at 538, and is now gathering them for 50+1, and is just if there's a poll out there, she has probably found it. So
I do my best.
Yes, exactly. So I thought it'd be good to maybe just start a little bit with the sort of top line, just the general takeaway you had. We saw a lot of narrative coverage early in January about some survey data about young men and how they had maybe soured a bit on Donald Trump as president, felt like he wasn't necessarily living up to what they'd hoped for, wasn't necessarily following through with some of the things he promised. And I thought, one of the things I want to get at, and even from the start here, is that one of your big takeaways being, well, yeah, he's lost ground among young men, but he's lost ground among other groups too.
Yeah.
And just sort of getting at what you found looking at that stuff.
Yeah. So, I was reading some of the coverage of that Speaking with American Men survey, and it was really surprising to me how much it was framed as a uniquely young men shaped problem for the Republican Party, when I really don't think that's the case. So the first point I would make here is that it's not at all clear to me that even pre-election, young men actually liked Trump very much, right? When you think about voting in an election, it's not necessarily like, I'm voting for this candidate and I'm glad about it. You're like, I'm voting for this candidate because I would rather that person be the president than the other candidate available to me in this race. So even if you look before the election in the Harvard Youth Poll, their final study among 18 to 29-year-olds pre-election, they had Trump underwater on favorability with young men by 21 points even then, 36% favorable and 57% unfavorable. So it's not all that surprising to me that young men don't have a particularly favorable impression of Donald Trump today. They never really did. The Speaking with American Men survey they referenced that showed Donald Trump with a 56% favorable rating among young men. I have not seen that study. I have not seen any study that gets even a little bit near that kind of a number.
It may have been referencing the thing that I was reading. It may have been referencing actually some different polling by the same pollster who did that. So the point is, like, it was trying to talk about how there had been a drop, at least to some extent. This was in an article from Puck.
Right. That's right. But that earlier survey was not included in the article. So I don't know. I haven't seen it. I don't know what's going on with that. But if that is true, if they got a 56% favorability reading among young men for Donald Trump, I would be astonished. Now, I have written about how we have seen Trump's approval falling faster among young people than it has been among other age cohorts. So I'm not actually all that surprised that young people are sort of souring on the president faster than older people. Part of that is that, younger voters' opinions are less developed when it comes to politics. So
Less entrenched, you might say.
Exactly.
Yeah,
They came in hopeful and their hopes were dashed, perhaps. Or perhaps this is a last in, first out kind of situation. Young men, or not young men, young people in general, moved more in the 2024 election than older demographics. Again, more elastic opinions, really swingier voters. So I'm pretty convinced that age is part of this. But when you look by gender, it's way less clear. So I took a look at the Harvard Youth Poll. There have been two this year, one in the spring, that was in March, and one in November. Or I guess that was last year. Time keeps ticking forward. And if you looked at Donald Trump's approval rating in their March 2025 survey and November 2025 survey, it fell almost identically among young men and among young women. It fell 5 points among young men and 6 points among young women. So it seems to me that young people are sort of moving together. Now, young men may have been at a higher baseline, but it still sort of appears like they're basically moving together.
So yeah, and sort of thinking, we know that maybe opinions among younger voters, younger Americans, have moved quicker in one direction. But on the whole, I think one of the takeaways we want to have people to have from this conversation is that they have generally moved away or have grown more negative, sort of regardless of the group you're looking at. And I think, a good way to talk about that is to look at Donald Trump's approval ratings. This is as of almost 2:00 on February 11th, Wednesday, February 11th. Donald Trump's approval rating and Decision Desk HQ's average overall is just shy of 42% approve, about 55% disapprove. But then if you look, if you start doing gender crosstabs and you're looking among men, you get, there's right now men are at about 50% disapprove and 47% approve. And we know that men tend to lean more Republican relative to women and vice versa, women more Democratic. But over time, if you sort of look from earlier in Trump's presidency, yes, the numbers move around. Crosstabs can especially be noisy, but you see sort of a general trend down in his approval and a general trend increase in disapproval. With women, you end up seeing the same thing, even if the starting point, right now among women, the disapprove is about 60% disapprove and 37% approve. So a much more negative number than the men, net negative. But nonetheless, you see over time, okay, well, he was back in the 40s and then just slowly but surely ticking down in terms of approval to now in the mid to high 30s, and the disapprove numbers going up. If you just sort of take blocks of average over time, to sort of get a better sense of where is sort of the new normal.
Actually, I was looking at the DDHQ approval data earlier today, and I wanted to see, we talk a lot about in politics the gender gap. So generally speaking, women are a little bit more Democratic, men are a little bit more Republican, and the gap between them, that's what we refer to as the gender gap. Now, I like to calculate that just on one number, not on the net, so just on the approval. So I went to look at the DDHQ data today, And I looked at the gender gap on February 20th of last year and the gender gap as it stands today. I chose February 20th because there's a lot of noise in the early month of the presidency while things are getting started. So I wanted to skip past all that noisy stuff at the beginning. The gender gap, the difference between approval for men and women on February 20th was 11.7 points. If you look at it today, it's 9.7 points. So it's a 2-point difference in the gender gap, which, as you mentioned, on a crosstab average could just be noise, right? So like men and women really have moved roughly the same amount when you look at that approval rating. And in my recent piece, I also framed this with respect to the generic ballot. And that is also basically we are seeing movement essentially in lockstep between men and women. They start at different places, but they're moving in the same direction. Yeah, exactly. So this is
so I've brought up the generic ballot chart that Mary had for her piece because I thought, yeah, I definitely wanted to include this.
Yeah, exactly. And I rather than a moving average there where it can be really sort of difficult to disentangle the overall trend, that's just a line of best fit. So you can really see the slopes on those two lines of best fit are very close to each other. I believe it's in the text below there somewhere, but I believe the difference between the slopes was like less than a tenth of a point. So
yeah, so basically for people who are listening, you essentially have a situation where both lines are slightly moving up when it comes to the margin for Democrats, Democrat minus Republican in the
mhm.
generic ballot. Men are less supportive, or still somewhat more supportive of Republicans than women, are somewhat more supportive of Republicans than Democrats. So Republicans lead slightly, and then among women, Democrats lead somewhat. But you see things trending on both among both sexes toward the Democrats on margin. So
And
that
at almost
that's sort of
exactly the same rate. At almost
it,
exactly the same rate.
right, and the rate is the key here. It's like not a notable. There's not really a perceptive difference here by for men or women. So sort of getting at the idea that yes, Donald Trump is losing ground among different groups, including young men, but not necessarily so much faster among one group than another.
Mhm.
That we should necessarily just put all the narrative focus on that one group. Though it's easy to do. And we
Yes.
having written for having been journalists, we understand like it's you really want to like have a narrative because it's helpful for people understanding things. And sometimes there is something you can really hit on. And if he's losing support among one group faster than another, that is interesting. And
Yeah.
and is very much worth discussing. It's just sort of like, let's not overstate the case.
Yeah, well, and the other thing I would mention here is like we can clearly see that Trump is losing support among all demographic groups, which you would expect, right? If the electorate is moving, people are generally going to be moving in the same direction, even if the order of magnitude is a little bit different. But we don't actually have like a ton of data that we can rely on for this like subsample of young men, right? Like when we wanted just in this conversation, when we wanted to start talking of more broad trends, we had to drop the young part and do just the men and women part because there's not enough data on young men to make sort of like these great sweeping conclusions. You know, I wrote this piece about this Speaking with American Men survey and then trends among young people in general. I was only able to reference like 3 surveys in the entire piece because there are so few polls that are able to focus in on this demographic. So
And I
what
think
we don't
almost all of them may have been by the same pollster.
yeah, John
John
Della
Della
Volpe does a
Volpe,
lot of
who
them.
yeah, John
The
Della Volpe does a lot of that,
Yale
does a lot
Youth
of the
poll is doing some surveys among young people as well. But their most recent survey, they to my knowledge, did not publish a crosstab among young people. So it's kind of difficult to dig into the trends.
shucks.
Um, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, they're doing very interesting work, but it doesn't elucidate this particular problem if they're not publishing full crosstabs.
But hey, we also understand the hesitance there. We were talking before we got started. We were looking at I mentioned at the start that there are different organizations that have released data about what actually happened in the 2024 election. And sometimes that data tends to broadly agree, but there are sometimes some differences.
Yeah.
One might have young men going for Trump, another might have young men narrowly going for Harris. the general consensus was that Trump did better than he did in 2020, and by a notable amount. But it just might vary from survey to survey. But we were going to say that, like in some cases, even for a larger sample survey like that, looking at like validated voters, there's a certain crosstab they might not publish because they
Yeah.
just don't have a large enough sample size to feel comfortable putting that data out there. And it just speaks to the difficulties of kind of cutting the electorate into smaller pieces and having reliable data to try to actually get a read of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, and to your point, like we talk about, my preferred validated voter survey is the Catalyst. Other people may disagree. It doesn't really matter. But these are fundamentally surveys and models, right? So like whatever numbers they're coming up with is based on, yes, very well done research. Like I don't want to disparage these groups at all. I think they're doing vital research to help us understand the electorate. But underneath it, there is a model, right? You can't actually know who young men voted for because we have a secret ballot. You don't get to know who people voted for. So we're having to use, surveys and precinct data and models to try to get at this. But the point is we don't really have like a firm grasp on exactly where these like little slices of the electorate sit. I mean, really, like, I think one of the things that's happening right now is after every election, there becomes like a group of voters that is like the group of voters that are the narrative of that election. And often with very good reason. It is absolutely true that Donald Trump won the 2024 election because of improved margins among young voters and voters of color. Like all of the research, all of the studies point in that direction. So that becomes like the group that people want to talk about. In previous elections, sometimes it's educated suburban voters. It's something
Soccer
that's
moms,
even
yeah,
like something that's not even an actual group, like soccer moms or Six Pack Joe or whatever, right? We like to pick a like voter category that becomes like this is the voter of the future. They're going to decide all of the elections of the future. But I think that's a lot of fighting the last battle, right? Because as we see, I mentioned earlier, we generally expect that like the folks who most recently joined the coalition are often those who leave it the fastest, right? So like you'll get that last in, first out stuff where maybe voters are like, oh, I'm going to take a flyer on voting for someone from a different party, and then they don't like the outcome and they go back. Thermostatic public opinion is coming for Donald Trump, just like it comes for everybody else. And the young elastic voters, I'm not surprised to see moving much more with that thermostatic dynamic because they do not have decades of experience voting or thinking about politics. They're learning as they go, just like all of us.
Exactly. Right before we started, you pointed out there was even you find the polls, right? I hadn't even seen it yet, but there was brand new polling out from Third Way, which is a Democratic firm, sort of a center left centrist Democratic firm, moderate firm that was focusing on younger voters. And you
Young men
said you had some
specifically.
findings that you wanted to share, thought were pertinent to this conversation. So I'd love to hear
Yeah.
more about that.
Yeah, that survey was among registered voters aged 18 to 29, men only. Again, we're very focused on young men, so they've commissioned a whole survey. It was conducted
Look,
in
there were a lot of
December.
podcasts and a lot of politicians going on podcasts.
It is hard out here in the content mines, okay?
Sorry. Anyway.
So it's registered voters, men aged 18 to 29, and was conducted in December. Now, one of the things I wanted to point out here is that there's like a big difference between the registered voters and their likely voter model on those men. And I think that's also going to be, I mean, like this is fodder for the content of Osphere in like 6 months from now, or what month are we? It's February. God, we have 9 months to go. Okay.
Yeah, bad news. It's a little longer than you thought.
Yeah, right. It's fodder for the contentosphere in 9 months that we're going to see a much bigger swing among young men, probably in November, because the likely voter universe in November is significantly more Democratic than the registered voter universe of young men. And this is something we've been seeing like across demographic groups, that the likeliest voters that are going to turn out for every midterm are becoming more Democratic leaning. So it's possible that come November, we see a much larger swing among these lower propensity voters, young voters being in that lower propensity group. And then we're going to have like the opposite takeaway, that like some brand new thing about young men. So just to be specific about their numbers, the generic ballot among registered voters in their survey, they had Democrats leading by 18. Again, that's young men aged 18 to 29. But when they add their LV screen, that lead jumps up to 30 points. So a 12-point difference between the registered voter sample and the likely voter sample is pretty significant among this demographic. So I think we are possibly in for like a whole brand new set of takes and polls trying to understand young men in the post midterms environment to come.
And I think that's a good opportunity to remind people that presidential elections, highest turnout, one of the ways that Trump won, you saw it in polling ahead of the election and in the aftermath, and survey data of people who voted. He tended to do better with voters who were less engaged, less politically engaged. And those are exactly the kind of voters who are less likely to show up in a midterm where there is lower turnout. Now, we've had high turnout midterms during the Trump era, for sure, the highest in modern times, basically highest since like the early 20th century. But that's not even the same thing, same electorate, in terms of
100 years ago,
women couldn't vote. You couldn't vote
ago
in most states back then, Mary. It's very so it's almost like not worth even comparing it to that. It's like modern times, it's been the highest turnout midterm electorate, and that's because people are very Trump is a very polarizing figure. People are very engaged with politics. So I think there are maybe more people who would qualify as highly engaged, perhaps now, or at least to a certain line, maybe like middle engaged. Maybe there's like the average engagement is higher, and more people are sort of hitting that line enough to vote in a midterm election. But at the same time, some of those voters are not going to show. Some of those lesser engaged voters are not going to show up in a midterm, and they were ones that Trump did better with on average in 2024. And so, of course, in a Democratic leaning midterm environment, which we appear to be headed for, at least to some extent, with a Republican in the White House.
Which you should expect because there's a Republican in the White House.
Yes. And then Democrats on average, just holding everything else equal with a Republican in the White House, are somewhat more likely to show up to vote. This is concept differential turnout. Just like in 2022, even though I know Democrats didn't do as badly, they didn't lose that much ground in the House and they actually gained a seat in the Senate, it was still actually a more Republican-leaning electorate. It's just that Democrats happen to do better than usual in the persuasion column in that midterm than the president's party often does, and that's probably a lot of that's down to Dobbs and some other things.
I think there's also some debate here about whether this is just like whether the Democratic Party in particular has made some lasting gains among the highest propensity voters that are independent of the political environment. So for example, when you think about education polarization, right, we've seen Democrats make significant and lasting gains with voters that have a college degree. Those are also among the more likely voters to turn out to vote. So there may be some like diminishing benefit for Republicans in all midterm elections if those gains continue into the future. Now, they may not, right? Like we all are like looking on with like trepidation on whatever a post-Trump Republican Party looks like because everyone has no idea. So that may change, but to the extent that the political polarization benefits Democrats among the highest propensity voters, that may also have had something to do with the Democrat overperformance in 2022.
Oh, exactly. No, thank you. That's very worth mentioning. The point is just broadly, Democrats may have a better midterm electorate than they used to, and a better one than Republicans. And it's funny because, of course, during the Obama years, there was all this talk on the left about how, oh no, our electorate is weaker in midterm years, and the fact that it was Democrat in the White House and it was Republican leaning midterms on top of that fact may have made 2010 and 2014 particularly bad. A lot of moving parts with all this, but I think the general thing is we do see important changes in terms of what is going on with both parties' electorates, But it's also worth remembering that it's not necessarily apples to apples when we hear people comparing 2026 numbers to 2024 numbers.
Right.
It's like, yeah,
Especially when we're talking about young people.
yes. Because yeah, you could go from, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I remember looking at this, like the current population survey, like turnout rates for age. It was like 60 something or 50 something. It was 50 something for people 18 to 29, and 18 was a lot lower than 29, of course, in terms of the presidential election turnout. But then if you compared it to like the 2022 midterm turnout, which was still a pretty high midterm turnout election, yeah, it was in the 30s, right, for that 18
Yeah.
to 29 group. So you are talking about a substantial drop off in terms of the number of people who are voting.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Catalyst 2024 report right now, and it estimates 18 to 29-year-olds were 15% of the electorate in 2024. In 2020, they were estimated to be 16%. In 2016, 15%. So roughly 15% of the electorate under the age of 30 in presidential elections. In the 2022 midterms, they have 10% of the electorate, 18 to 29. So like just as a huge drop off in representation among voters under 30 in that midterm.
Yeah. So, and maybe this is a good time, since we're talking about midterms, maybe this is a good time to sort of segue to the kind of what I wanted to close on. Well, close, but we can talk for a bit, obviously, about sort of Trump's approval rating, looking ahead to the midterms, some of what we're seeing. Because you also wrote a piece recently, or relatively recently, about uh, some of the specific groups that were maybe core to Trump's victory in 2024, the groups where you did see some maybe sharper increases in his support level and losing ground with them. And I was going to pull up our I was going to pull back up the Decision Desk HQ approval numbers here and maybe talk a little bit about some of them. For instance, I think one of the telling things, and thinking about the 2026 midterms moving forward, 9 months out, Trump is not doing well among independent voters now, or independents. I should just say independents broadly. That's not necessarily the end of the world in a midterm election, because those voters are frankly just on average less likely to turn out, because most people who identify as independent are just less politically engaged.
Yeah.
There's definitely a correlation between political engagement and partisanship. You don't have a ton of politically engaged true independents. That's not a huge block, though they are oftentimes a very affluent group, very engaged. But I just want to make that's like an important point here. But some of those voters are going to show up. And thinking about midterm math, an independent voter who voted for Donald Trump in 2024 and still who votes in the 2026 midterms and decides that they're kind of ticked off at the current situation and ends up voting for the Democrat in their local House race or local Senate race, that's a net gain of 2.
Yeah, 2 on the margin.
2 on the margin. So that's why it matters that Trump, who, depending on the thing, depending on the survey, slightly carried or was roughly tied among independents in the 2024 presidential election. The fact that his approval rating now in Decision Desk HQ's average for independents is at 31%, and his disapproval is at 62%, is not great on that front.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, that's much worse than the electorate overall. And I mean, so I'll reference some data, and I want to caveat that this is incomplete data. I'm still working on building this data set for an upcoming piece. But if you look on the key issues, the numbers among independents are pretty dire here. So if you look at immigration, for example, at the beginning of his term, if you look in like the first couple of months, he was above water on approval of handling immigration among independent voters. Now, in the last month or so, he's underwater by over 30 points. I don't want to give a precise number because like I said, this data is incomplete, but I can tell you it's over 30 points, possibly close to 40 points underwater on that key issue of immigration with independent voters. That is so much worse than among the population overall. So Elliot Morris, our former colleague, has ongoing tracking of approval rating on various issues at his Substack Strength in Numbers, powered by 50+1 data. He's underwater on every key issue on immigration among the overall electorate, he's underwater by 9 points. Now, remember what I said about independents. Almost 40 points underwater among independents, 9 points among the electorate overall. That is enormous. So I think like that's one example, and you see similar stuff on a lot of other key issues. On the economy, he started off the first month underwater by around 8 points on the economy with independence. Again, it's over 30 points today, around 35 points underwater on the economy with independence. And again, that's much worse than the overall numbers you see with the electorate at large. So it seems that based on these numbers, independents are much more sour on the president than the overall electorate. Um, and what you were referencing before, the piece I wrote late last year about some key demographic groups, you can see Trump's approval rating falling faster with those swingier demographic groups that were key to his coalition in 2024. Black voters, Hispanic and Latino voters, young voters. His approval rating is going down among all the groups. It's going down much faster with those swingy sort of like new Trump voters that he had converted or persuaded in 2024. And I think like the fundamental thing here that has been misunderstood about the 2024 electorate, when people have been looking back on it up until, I guess, relatively recently in the face of some recent Democratic successes, people are sort of treating this shift among Latino voters as if it's like permanent and forever, that they will become reliable Republican voters. I guess my sort of takeaway from all the data is that I don't think that Donald Trump actually ever had those voters. They voted for him, but I don't think he had them in some very fundamental sense of the word. They chose to vote for Donald Trump over Kamala Harris. That does not mean that they are Republicans. That's like a completely orthogonal question when you look at these elastic independent groups, and they seem like they really are not happy with how things are going now.
Yeah, and thinking about Latino voters, because that's an easy one for just we recently had this special election in the state Senate in Texas that got a lot of attention, where a Democrat won overwhelmingly in a district in Tarrant County around Fort Worth that previously was I think Trump had carried it by like 17 or something in the 2024 presidential election, and the Democrat won handily. Now there were some local issues that I think tied into that, and it's not. There's like a really easy story there, right? It's just like absolute proof that Democrats are going to win like a gigantic blue wave in the midterms. But I do think it is a data point that is concerning for Republicans, because there were a fair number of heavily Latino precincts in that district. And there were some precinct analyses that found, yes, the Democratic numbers were a lot better. Now, some of that could be down to who was actually turning out. And so some of those less engaged Latino voters who Trump may have won over in the 2024 presidential election were not turning out for a special election, early in 2026, regularly timed special election. But nonetheless, there is the thought that there is at least perhaps some evidence of at least some parts of the electorate swinging. And when you're talking about the swingiest groups, thinking about Latino voters who are somewhat more likely to be independent, look, Latino voters on the whole, I mean, again,
they're much younger than the electorate overall.
100%. They are much younger on average. And so if we think about younger voters tending to be more likely to be independent, makes sense that Latino voters would be perhaps the most independent of sort of groups if you're breaking them down by race or ethnicity, knowing, of course, that then there are many like sort of fine grains and interesting distinctions within Latinos as a whole. So we shouldn't just paint them with one big brush. But obviously it was a talking point, and in parts, rural areas where Republicans made big gains in places like South Texas, the fact that in Texas, where you did see evidence of Latino voters shifting toward Donald Trump pretty markedly in 2024, to see a district and its precincts shift markedly toward Democrats it should be a worrying sign, I would think, for Republicans, at least to some extent.
Oh yeah. And I mean, if you want to like take the specialness of the special election out of it, I think you can also see this if you look at the New Jersey election in particular.
Yes.
The New Jersey gubernatorial election, which is not a special election. It's a regularly scheduled election. And I know that Latinos that live in New Jersey are probably very different than South Texas Latinos. They have different concerns and
Again,
different
not the
priorities.
same brush. No,
Not
no.
exactly, but we did see among heavily Latino precincts in New Jersey, there were some turnout gains relative to previous elections, which Tia Yang and I wrote about for Vote Hub recently, if you want to go check that out. So there's some turnout gains for Democrats among Latinos, and a pretty significant margin shift compared to the 2024 election among those heavily Latino precincts. So there's signs all over the place that these young voters and Latino voters are definitely moving, I guess, back a little bit toward Democrats. How much that change is going to be is yet to be seen. I really do think, especially among Latino voters, and I've written about this before, that we are witnessing the birth of a new swing demographic, right? That this cohort of young Latino voters is probably going to be something we continue talking about in elections to come. Their political opinions are a little more heterodox than like strong Democrat or Republican opinions. They tend to be a little bit more socially conservative. They have really nuanced views on immigration that you don't see among other racial demographics, right? So because a lot of young Latinos are closer to the immigration process than a lot of white or Black Americans, they tend to have very nuanced views about, uh, coming in the right way, doing what their parents did, whatever. There's a lot
Yeah,
of
it's like the immigration process, border security, but then also like treatment. Like there's just like a
yeah,
lot of different
yeah,
elements. And to your point, it's like there are different parts of this.
right, yes. And like I said, that's going to probably be more salient to a South Texas Latino voter than to a New Jersey Latino voter who's more likely to be Puerto Rican and not touched by the immigration system in the same way.
And maybe this is maybe a good place to sort of to actually close. You mentioned G. Elliott Morris, our old 538 colleague, and Strength in Numbers, which is his Substack, which is powered by the data from 50+1.
Mhm.
He has this, and you mentioned it, so I did bring it up on screen, and so I wanted to touch on it specifically, talking about sort of, and I think this can get to our overall takeaway here of like Trump is losing ground among all groups, at least to some extent. And perhaps it's no coincidence when you kind of think about, well, different people have different issues that are most important to them.
Mhm.
And then what Elliott's aggregation of issue data shows is that, well, Trump's approval rating on different issues has generally fallen.
Yep.
And in some cases by a lot, depending on the issue, including perhaps, I think most notably, his strongest issue, as you can see on this chart if you're looking at it on the screen, was always immigration. So his net, his net approval on immigration, how he's handling immigration was his strongest issue from the get-go. And then it has
Yeah,
slowly
it's
declined and is now is net negative. And it's, a core issue and one of his strengths, and has been one of his strengths forever.
Yeah, just for listeners who aren't seeing this, immigration is the only issue where he remained above water for a solid period of time into the presidency. For about 6 months, remained above water on immigration, even as he was underwater on pretty much all the other issues that Elliott is tracking here. At the beginning of the presidency, actually, I probably looked in March because I like to avoid that noisy period in the
Sure.
first month or so where you see it dip and go back up again. But he's above water by around 9 points on immigration early in the presidency, and now is underwater by, again, around 9 points. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I highlighted it on screen for people who are watching. Yeah, so
Yeah, what I think is interesting actually is, I mean, I didn't check this, so someone can go correct me if I'm wrong, but it does look like most of these issues, once you hit around July or so, they're pretty much falling at roughly the same rate. I think once you hit about around that time in July, where we've seen enough of the Trump presidency and the electorate is sort of getting used to what's going on here, you just see like, I think honestly around that time is when voters sort of split into the I'm with the Trump presidency and I'm not with the Trump presidency camps, and there's a lot less nuance, so people are just always approve or always disapprove. There's obviously some variation, but I think it's around July when the sort of trickle of continued decline really sets in.
yeah, and at that point you've had basically 6 months of stories about the thing, various actions that Trump has taken in his presidency, and people are going to have strong opinions about what he chose to do, one way or the other. Things like Doge getting a lot of attention, and certain
Mhm.
cuts, and various actions that the Trump administration is taking, really kind of flying from the get go once they took office. It's second time around, there was definitely evidence that they had sort of a better plan of action from the get go in terms of what they wanted to pursue once Trump took office.
They were certainly
Uh,
more organized.
yes, 100%, and I think that gets at it. I wanted to just note, sort of in the same vein, maybe, and it's going to vary a little bit from sort of point to point, but I do think, just to finish up on Trump's approval rating, like in Decision Desk's average, the thing I've been telling people is, if you sort of look at our average, and it's going to vary from average to average, but throughout the first 10 or so months of his presidency, in our average, he mostly was around 45% approval. Again,
Mhm.
it's going to vary from average to average, where that sort of general
Yeah, but
long-term trend was.
they'll all be directionally roughly the same
Oh,
because
absolutely.
we're
Yes, it
all
could be 43 in one, 45 in another.
yeah, we're
And in
all
our
using the
average,
same underlying data, right?
precisely. And it's just a question of the choices being made with the data once you have it. After basically around the time of the November elections, you see a downtick in Trump's approval rating. And while it has moved around a little bit in our average, it's more hovering in the 42-43% range.
Mhm.
And I think that speaks to and you see this also with the disapproval number, it jumping from around the mid, like 52-53% range, to now it's more closer to 55 regularly percent disapproval. It suggests something happened, like an actual shift happened,
Yeah.
among the public writ large.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things you could attribute that to. You could attribute it to the outcome of the November elections, kind of depressing Republicans. You could attribute it to what's going on in Minneapolis, really making people angry. There's a lot of different elements, and this is always the case with approval. There's always going to be a bunch of different things happening all at once, and you can't really disentangle what's causing what. I do think it's interesting, though. I mean, sometimes when I look at this approval data, especially among um, small subgroups, rather than try to calculate a moving average, one of the things I like to do is just look at month by month averages to try to reduce the noise so you can really see what's going on. And I think that's a really interesting point, Geoffrey, that you see, like, for the first 10 months or so, it's hovering at this roughly 45 number. Now it's jumped down and it's hovering at 42-ish. I would be interested to see if we see another jump before the November elections, because another jump downward before the November elections could be like really problematic for the Republicans in that election. I think it is my personal opinion, based on the data, that the House is a foregone conclusion for the Democrats at this point, unless something dramatically changes. The Senate is not for either party. I think depends on what happens, and if we see another jump down, I would think the Republicans need to worry about their Senate position.
Yeah, I think that's broadly right. I mean, look, I think if you go seat by seat with the House, it's easier to find a path for Republicans to somehow holding on, but it's gonna be extremely difficult for
Yeah,
them to hold on to the House. Just the pure numbers, even because it's not gonna barely take any gain for the Democrats, even with all the redistricting shuffling going on. At the end of the
it's mostly a
day,
wash.
yeah, at this point, it's looking closer to a wash than anything else. And so, with that in mind, if there is kind of a broad swing, even not a huge swing to the left, that's enough for Democrats to pick up 10, 15 seats or something and then have a majority.
Yeah, and
Doesn't
they
have
don't
to
need 10 or
be,
15 seats. They don't need
yeah,
10 or 15 seats. They need
no, they
what,
need
4?
three.
Okay.
Or, well, yeah, they need three to go from 215 to 218 if you're accounting for the vacancies.
Yeah.
uh, you know, so yeah, it's not you don't that's extremely narrow in the House, but the Senate is really difficult, and I do for Democrats, and I do think you are right. If we were to see it sort of bump down to, like, oh, is the next, if it shifted downward, it took another downshift for Trump, and it hung around at 40 or
Or yeah,
39
we
or
saw a
something.
3-point downshift between the first bid and the second bid, another 3-point downshift. Now you're in the 30s.
And then maybe something like Democrats being able to win, like in Ohio and Alaska or something, to have a path to a Senate majority is more feasible. I mean, it's already feasible, but
Right.
right now I think everyone would say that Republicans are favored to hold on to the Senate. because Democrats need to get an outright majority. That also is a big problem for them. Getting a fourth seat anywhere. Third seat's hard enough, I think, for them after North Carolina and Maine as their top two targets. But needing two other seats besides those two is really challenging. But, if Trump's approval took another downtick, of course, at the same time, it might tick back up a little bit.
Yeah, that's right.
That's
It could go either way. Yeah.
And we just don't know. Well, hey, Mary, I've taken a lot of your time. I really appreciate you talking to me about approval and reminding people that we're trying to do the best with the data we have here and understanding that just because there's a penchant for focusing on one particular group doesn't mean necessarily that group could be distinct in certain ways. And we're not trying to brush that aside. But if you're seeing a general trend for a president losing approval, they're probably losing ground with most groups, if not every group, at least to some extent. And so, yes, he's lost ground with young men, but he's also lost ground with young women. He's lost ground with Latinos. He's lost ground with
old men, old women.
Old women, yes. Old men, old women. These are all, maybe less because, as you pointed out, older people are more likely to have firmer partisan attachments. And so maybe they're a little, less likely to move than younger people on these questions. But nonetheless, you are going to see, broadly speaking, trends in a similar direction, just by different magnitudes. So This, I think, was a helpful conversation for sort of understanding what's going on with Trump's approval. Again, this is Mary Radcliffe, my former colleague at 538. She's the head of research at 50+1. Mary, do you want to plug your Substack at all?
I have a Substack. I don't really understand how Substack works. I don't write that often, really only when I feel like I have something to say. So you can go see what I've got up there right now. It's Mary with a 4 is the handle, and read this piece about young voters and look at some charts with very boring parallel lines.
Hey, I don't think they're boring. Hey, even my mother was like, "Hey, I read this piece by Mary Radcliffe the other day," and I was like, "All right, see, now I gotta have her on to talk about it on the podcast."
Hi, Geoffrey's mom.
Yes, she'll love that. But yes, thank you so much for your time and your analysis. You are one of the best at this, so I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about it. Again, I'm Geoffrey Skelley, the Chief Elections Analyst here at Decision Desk HQ. We will be back with more coverage of what's happening ahead of the 2026 midterms and podcasts to come. But until then, thank you so much for listening and watching.